It was nearly 3 in the morning on May 24, 1941, and a British naval officer aboard HMS Suffolk pressed his binoculars against his face while scanning the icy waters of the Denmark Strait, that narrow passage between Greenland and Iceland where the cold Atlantic meets the Arctic. And what he saw in that moment made his heart stop, because emerging from the gray mist was a shape so massive and so terrifying that he knew instantly everything was about to change. For cutting through those freezing waters like a blade through silk was the most feared warship on Earth, a floating fortress of steel and firepower that had haunted the nightmares of every Allied sailor since the day it slipped into the sea. And in just a few short minutes, this monster would do something so devastating that it would shake the entire British Empire to its core and launch the greatest naval hunt in human history. This was the Bismarck, and its story is one of the most extraordinary tales of the Second World War, a story of breathtaking engineering and fatal arrogance, of desperate bravery and impossible odds, of a single ship that terrified an entire nation, and the incredible chain of events that brought it crashing down into the cold darkness of the Atlantic Ocean forever. To truly understand what the Bismarck meant to the world in 1941, you have to understand the mind of Adolf Hitler and his obsession with building something that would prove German superiority to the world, because back in 1936, Hitler ordered his engineers to create the ultimate battleship, a vessel so powerful and so advanced that it would make every other navy on Earth look like a collection of fishing boats. And what emerged from the shipyards of Hamburg was nothing short of a masterpiece of naval engineering, a ship that stretched over 800 feet from bow to stern, which is roughly 2.5 football fields of pure killing power, with armor plating that was 13 inches thick in places, so dense that conventional shells would simply bounce off its sides like pebbles thrown against a castle wall. And mounted on its deck were 8 massive 15-inch guns arranged in 4 twin turrets, each one capable of hurling shells weighing nearly a ton at targets more than 20 miles away with devastating accuracy. And when you add in its secondary armament of 12 6-inch guns, 16 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, and dozens of smaller weapons bristling from every surface, you begin to understand why this ship was considered virtually unstoppable. When the Bismarck was launched in February 1939, with Hitler himself watching from the dock, the Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive, calling it the pride of Germany and declaring that this single vessel would bring the mighty British Empire to its knees. The ship was more than just a weapon, though. It was a floating city, home to over 2,200 men who lived and worked within its steel walls. And the German engineers had thought of everything these sailors might need during their long months at sea, because hidden within the armored hull was a full bakery that produced fresh bread every day, a dental office for keeping the crew healthy, a modern hospital with operating rooms, a movie theater where the men could watch films during their rare moments of rest, and even air conditioning systems to keep them comfortable in whatever climate they might encounter. And for the young German sailors who climbed aboard this magnificent vessel, it must have felt like stepping into an invincible fortress, a floating castle that could sail anywhere and destroy anything in its path. And many of them wrote letters home to their families expressing their pride at serving on what they believed was the most powerful ship ever built by human hands. But there was a man aboard the Bismarck who understood something that Hitler and his propaganda ministers refused to acknowledge, and that man was Captain Ernst Lindemann, a career naval officer with steel gray eyes and a reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths, because Lindemann knew that for all its impressive firepower and thick armor, the Bismarck had one fatal weakness that no amount of engineering could overcome. And that weakness was simply this: it was alone. The German Navy in 1941 was a shadow of its former glory, with only a handful of major surface ships remaining after years of war, while the British Royal Navy still commanded the seas with dozens of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers spread across every ocean on the planet. And Lindemann understood that if the Bismarck was ever cornered, ever trapped far from friendly waters, it would face the concentrated fury of an entire empire's fleet, and no single ship, no matter how powerful, could survive such an onslaught. There is a story, perhaps legend, but perhaps truth, that Lindemann gathered his officers privately before the Bismarck sailed on its first and only mission and told them with characteristic bluntness that they would either return as heroes or they would not return at all. And looking back now with the benefit of history, we know just how prophetic those words turned out to be. On May 18, 1941, the Bismarck slipped its moorings and headed out to sea on what the German High Command had codenamed Operation Rhine Exercise, and the mission was as ambitious as it was dangerous, because the plan called for the Bismarck and its companion ship, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, to break through the British naval blockade, reach the open Atlantic Ocean, and then unleash hell on the merchant convoys that were Britain's lifeline to the outside world. These convoys, loaded with food, fuel, ammunition, and all the supplies a nation needed to survive and fight, crossed the Atlantic in slow-moving groups, and they were desperately vulnerable to attack from fast, powerful warships, and the German commanders believed that if the Bismarck could get loose among these convoys, it could sink dozens of ships in a matter of weeks, cutting off Britain's supplies and potentially forcing the island nation to sue for peace. And this was no idle fantasy, because Britain in 1941 was already on the edge of starvation, with food rationing in effect and every cargo ship that reached port representing the difference between survival and surrender. But the British had eyes everywhere, and within hours of the Bismarck leaving port, British spies in Norway spotted the German warships and flashed an urgent warning back to London. And when that message reached Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the color reportedly drained from his face, because Churchill understood exactly what was at stake. And according to those who were present, he uttered just two words that conveyed all the terror of the moment: Bismarck is out. What followed was the largest naval mobilization in British history, as every warship that could be spared was ordered to converge on the Denmark Strait to stop the German monster before it could reach the open ocean. And leading this desperate hunt was one of the most famous ships in the Royal Navy, a vessel that the British public adored and trusted to protect them from any threat, and that ship was HMS Hood. The Hood was something special, a beautiful and elegant battlecruiser that had been the largest warship in the world for 20 years, and to the British people who had watched it sail majestically through ports around the globe, showing the flag and demonstrating British power to foreign nations, it was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of everything the Empire represented. And when the newspapers announced that the mighty Hood was being sent to stop the Bismarck, the public breathed a collective sigh of relief, because surely this beloved giant would make short work of the German upstart. But what the newspapers did not report, what the admirals knew but did not want to admit, was that the Hood was aging and vulnerable, a ship whose design dated back to the First World War and whose deck armor was dangerously thin. A weakness that had been scheduled for correction in a major refit plan for 1941, but postponed indefinitely when the war made every ship too valuable to take out of service. And this tragic combination of public confidence and hidden weakness would soon lead to one of the most devastating losses the Royal Navy had ever suffered. At 5:52 in the morning on May 24, 1941, lookouts on the Hood spotted the unmistakable silhouette of the Bismarck through the gray Arctic haze, and alongside the Hood was another British warship, the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales, and together these two ships represented the best hope Britain had of stopping the German breakout. And as the range closed, the British guns opened fire first, sending massive shells screaming across the water toward the enemy, but the first salvos missed, splashing harmlessly into the sea around the Bismarck, and then the German guns answered, and what happened in the next few minutes would haunt the Royal Navy for generations. The Bismarck's gunnery that morning was nothing short of extraordinary, and naval historians still debate how the German gunners achieved such devastating accuracy under such difficult conditions, but the facts speak for themselves, because within minutes of opening fire, the German shells began finding their mark. First, the Prinz Eugen scored hits on the Hood's deck, starting fires among the ready-use ammunition stored near the ship's anti-aircraft guns, and flames began to spread across the British ship, but worse was yet to come. Then came the moment that changed everything, when a 15-inch shell from the Bismarck's guns arced through the morning sky and punched through the Hood's thin deck armor near one of its main turrets. And what happened next was witnessed by hundreds of horrified sailors on both sides of the battle, because that shell penetrated deep into the Hood's hull and detonated in or near the ship's main ammunition magazines, where thousands of pounds of explosive shells and propellant charges were stored. And the resulting explosion was so catastrophic, so unimaginably violent, that witnesses described a pillar of flame shooting 1,000 feet into the sky, a tower of fire so massive that it seemed to tear the very ocean apart. And when the smoke cleared just seconds later, the mighty hood was gone, broken completely in half and sliding beneath the waves so quickly that there was no time for the crew to abandon ship. No time for the men trapped below decks to reach the lifeboats. No time for anything except the cold embrace of the North Atlantic rushing in to claim them. Of the 1,418 men aboard HMS Hood that morning, exactly 3 survived. Just 3 young sailors who were somehow thrown clear of the wreckage and managed to cling to tiny rafts until a British destroyer found them hours later. And those 3 men, Ted Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and Bill Dundas, would carry the burden of that terrible morning for the rest of their lives, haunted by memories of their shipmates who vanished into the depths in the blink of an eye. The destruction of the Hood in just 6 minutes sent shockwaves through Britain and around the world, because this was not just the loss of a warship. This was the death of a symbol, the end of an era, the brutal proof that the old order was crumbling and that nowhere was safe from the terrible power of modern warfare. And when the news reached London, there were those who wept openly in the streets, because the Hood had been part of British life for 20 years, and now it was gone, taking more than 1,400 sons and fathers and brothers to a cold grave at the bottom of the sea. The Prince of Wales, badly damaged by German shells and with several of its guns malfunctioning, had no choice but to retreat from the battle, and as it limped away under a screen of smoke, the Bismarck appeared to have won a crushing victory. But Captain Lindemann knew better, because he knew that the destruction of the Hood had not ended the threat. It had only made everything infinitely worse. What Lindemann understood, and what Admiral Günther Lütjens, the fleet commander aboard the Bismarck, perhaps did not fully appreciate, was that sinking the Hood had transformed this from a military operation into something far more dangerous, a matter of national pride and personal vengeance, because the British would never rest, never stop, never give up until the Bismarck was destroyed, and every ship, every plane, every submarine the Royal Navy possessed would now be hunting for them with a fury born of grief and rage. And the Bismarck had not escaped the battle unscathed either, because 3 shells from the Prince of Wales had found their mark, and one of them had done something that would prove catastrophic, rupturing fuel tanks and flooding forward compartments. And now the mighty warship was leaving a trail of oil across the gray Atlantic waters, a trail that any pursuing ship could follow like a bloodhound tracking wounded prey. Lindemann wanted to turn back, to return to Germany or Norway for repairs before continuing the mission, but Admiral Lütjens, perhaps driven by the euphoria of victory or perhaps by pressure from Berlin to achieve results, made the fateful decision to press on toward France, toward the port of Brest where German-occupied territory could provide safety and repairs. And this decision, made in the hours after the Hood's destruction, would seal the fate of the Bismarck and everyone aboard her. For 2 days, British cruisers shadowed the wounded battleship, tracking it by radar and staying just beyond the range of its fearsome guns. And aboard those cruisers, the British sailors watched and waited and reported the Bismarck's every movement back to London, where Churchill himself was following the chase with desperate intensity, because he knew that if the Bismarck reached the French coast, reached the protective umbrella of German aircraft and submarines, it might escape to fight another day, and that was something he simply could not allow. Then something incredible happened, something that demonstrated both the cunning of the Bismarck's crew and the desperation of its situation, because on the evening of May 24th, the great battleship suddenly turned and charged directly at its British pursuers, its massive guns trained and ready to fire, and the British cruisers scattered like startled birds, breaking formation and retreating at full speed to escape destruction. And in the chaos and confusion that followed, with rain squalls sweeping across the ocean and visibility dropping to almost nothing, the Bismarck vanished. For 31 agonizing hours, the most dangerous ship in the world was loose somewhere in the North Atlantic, and no one in the British Admiralty had any idea where it was or what it was doing. And the panic that swept through naval headquarters was almost physical, because every hour that passed meant the Bismarck could be getting closer to the convoy lanes, closer to the vulnerable merchant ships, closer to cutting Britain's lifeline and perhaps winning the war for Germany. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source and was caused by a German mistake, because Admiral Lütjens, apparently believing that the British were still tracking his ship by radar, sent a long radio message to Berlin, a transmission that lasted nearly 30 minutes, and reported on the battle with the Hood and the current status of his fleet. And what Lütjens did not realize was that the British had lost contact with him and would never have found him again if he had simply maintained radio silence. But that long transmission was picked up by British direction-finding stations scattered across the Atlantic, and by triangulating the signals, the British were able to determine roughly where the message had originated. And suddenly they knew that the Bismarck was not heading back to Germany as some had feared, but was instead making for the French coast, running for the safety of Brest. The hunt was back on, and now the British had a destination to work with, a place where they could concentrate their forces and cut off the Bismarck's escape. But there was a problem, because most of the British heavy ships were running low on fuel after the long chase, and the Bismarck was still faster than many of its pursuers, and if something did not slow it down, it would reach French waters before the British battleships could catch up, and once it was under the protection of German aircraft and submarines, destroying it would become almost impossible. The only hope lay with a small force that was racing north from Gibraltar, a task force built around the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. And aboard that carrier was a weapon so antiquated, so seemingly ridiculous, that many people could not believe it was being sent against the most powerful battleship in the world, and that weapon was the Fairey Swordfish, a biplane torpedo bomber that looked like it had escaped from a museum of First World War aviation. The Swordfish was an extraordinary aircraft, but not in the way most people would expect, because it was slow, fabric-covered, and open to the elements, with a top speed of barely 140 miles per hour and a design that had changed little since the early 1930s. And when German sailors first saw these rickety biplanes approaching through the storm clouds, they must have thought it was some kind of joke. But the joke would be on them, because what made the Swordfish deadly was not its speed or its power, but something far more important: the skill and courage of its crews and the devastating torpedo that hung beneath each aircraft's belly. These were men who flew into battle knowing that their slow, fragile aircraft made them perfect targets for anti-aircraft fire. Men who pressed their attacks at wave-top height through storms of exploding shells. And on the evening of May 26, 1941, 15 of these magnificent anachronisms took off from the pitching deck of the Ark Royal in weather so terrible that the carrier was heaving through 50-foot waves, and they flew into history. The attack that followed was one of the most desperate and courageous actions of the entire war, as the Swordfish crews dove through sheets of rain and walls of anti-aircraft fire, fighting to keep their slow aircraft under control in winds that threatened to tear them apart. While below them the Bismarck twisted and turned like a wounded beast, trying to present the smallest possible target and filling the sky with a storm of exploding shells. Most of the torpedoes missed, either dodged by the maneuvering battleship or thrown off course by the terrible weather. But one torpedo, perhaps launched by a young Scottish pilot named John Moffat, though historians still debate this point, found its mark, and it struck the Bismarck in the one place where its armor could not protect it, in the stern where the ship's massive rudders controlled its ability to steer. The explosion jammed both rudders at a 12-degree angle to port, and suddenly the most powerful battleship in the world could only steam in circles, trapped and helpless, unable to escape the doom that was racing toward it across the dark Atlantic waters. Captain Lindemann knew immediately that the end had come, and he reportedly told his crew with the same brutal honesty he had always shown that they would fight to the last shell, but that they could not win, and he urged his men to save themselves when the time came, because there was no point in dying for a ship that was already dead. Through that long, terrible night, British destroyers harassed the crippled Bismarck with torpedo attacks and gunfire, keeping the exhausted German crew at battle stations, denying them any rest, wearing them down for the slaughter that everyone knew was coming with the dawn. And when morning broke on May 27, 1941, the British battleships King George V and Rodney appeared on the horizon, their massive guns already training on the helpless target, and what followed was not a battle but an execution, a systematic destruction of a ship that could no longer fight back effectively. Starting at 8:47 in the morning, the British ships pounded the Bismarck from point-blank range, closing to within just 2 miles to ensure that every shell found its mark, and the German ships' fire control systems were destroyed in the opening minutes. leaving its guns unable to aim properly, turning its once fearsome armament into useless metal. For nearly 2 hours, the British poured shells into the Bismarck, more than 2,800 rounds in total, and the ship was transformed into a burning, twisted wreck, its superstructure torn apart, its gun turrets blasted into silence, its decks awash with blood and fire. But still it would not sink, because the German engineers had built it so well, with such thick armor and such careful compartmentalization, that even this incredible punishment could not send it to the bottom. In the end, it was the Germans themselves who finished the job, as surviving crew members opened the seacocks and set off scuttling charges, flooding the ship from within and finally allowing the ocean to claim what British shells could not destroy. And at 10:39 in the morning, the Bismarck rolled over and slipped beneath the waves, taking more than 2,000 of its crew to their deaths in the cold Atlantic depths. Of the 2,200 men who had sailed aboard the Bismarck just 8 days earlier, only 114 would survive to be pulled from the freezing water by British ships, and that rescue itself became a tragedy, because when a U-boat alarm sounded, the British vessels were forced to leave the area with hundreds of German sailors still struggling in the water, men who had survived the battle only to die of exposure and exhaustion as they watched their would-be rescuers steam away over the horizon. Captain Ernst Lindemann, the man who had predicted this ending before the voyage even began, chose to go down with his ship, and survivors reported seeing him standing at attention on what remained of the bridge, saluting as the water rushed in around him, a final gesture of defiance and dignity in the face of inevitable death. Admiral Lütjens also perished, his body never recovered from the depths where the shattered hulk of his flagship came to rest. The Bismarck had been at sea for exactly 8 days, and in that brief span it had destroyed the pride of the British Navy and terrified an entire nation. But it had also proven something that naval strategists would spend decades analyzing: that the age of the battleship was ending, that these massive, expensive, vulnerable ships could be brought down by a handful of obsolete biplanes with the right weapons and the right courage, and that the future of naval warfare belonged to aircraft, carriers, and submarines, not to the floating fortresses that had dominated the seas since the days of wooden ships and canvas sails. Never again would any nation invest such resources in building a single giant surface warship, and the lesson of the Bismarck would echo through military planning for generations to come. Nearly 50 years later, in June of 1989, an American oceanographer named Robert Ballard, the same man who had discovered the wreck of the Titanic 4 years earlier, found the Bismarck resting on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean about 400 miles west of France, sitting upright in the mud at a depth of nearly 16,000 feet, its hull remarkably intact despite the terrible damage it had sustained in its final battle. The ship had struck an underwater mountain during its long fall to the bottom, triggering a landslide that carried it partway down the slope, and there it remains to this day, its massive guns still pointing skyward as if waiting for an enemy that will never come, its decks still bearing the scars of that terrible morning when the Royal Navy took its revenge for the Hood. The wreck is now considered a war grave, a memorial to the more than 2,000 young men who lie entombed within its rusting hull, and by international agreement, it will never be disturbed or salvaged, left in peace as a reminder of the terrible cost of war and the fragility of even the mightiest human creations. The story of the Bismarck is ultimately a story about the dangers of pride and the folly of believing that any single weapon, no matter how powerful, can guarantee victory against a determined enemy with greater resources and an unbreakable will to fight. The Bismarck was magnificent, a triumph of engineering and a testament to what human ingenuity could create, but it was also alone, a single ship against an empire, and in war, being alone is the one weakness that no amount of armor or firepower can overcome. Its crews were brave men who fought with skill and courage, but they were sent on a mission that was doomed from the start, sacrificed to prove a point that had already been disproven by history, and they paid the ultimate price for the arrogance of leaders who valued symbols more than lives. The Bismarck's only victory was also the beginning of its end, for the moment it sank the Hood, it guaranteed its own destruction, turning a naval operation into a crusade and ensuring that the entire Royal Navy would not rest until the German giant was destroyed. 8 days of glory and terror, and then nothing but cold silence at the bottom of the sea, where the great ship waits in darkness, a monument to human ambition and human folly, forever.